All right, welcome everybody. Thanks a lot for joining us today. I've got a very important discussion today with two very important and influential voices. We're going to talk about Australia's world first under-16s social media ban or delay, depending on which way you want to talk about it, that's now 5 days old. Now, we've heard a lot from government. We've heard a lot from people that have opinions. We've heard a lot from parents. We haven't heard quite so much from people that worked inside Meta and inside Facebook that have slightly differing insights. And so we thought it was really important to invite two of them on. So I'm joined today, thank you very much indeed. I'm joined by Kelly Stonelake, who was a former Meta executive and worked on Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse, and who warned about child harms and then soon after was laid off by the company. She now advocates for child safety and tech regulation and has branded social media as a breeding ground for harm. Her work includes advising the US Federal Trade Commission, delivering feedback on child protection laws, and she publishes a Substack about these issues called Overturned. So Kelly, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. And Brian Bolland was a vice president in the ads and marketing teams at Meta until 2020, and now he advised governments on policies and platform accountability. He was a witness before the US Senate on social media's impact on national security, and has said that Meta, YouTube, X, and TikTok have prioritized growth over safety. He was also a Department of Justice witness at the trial that ruled Google holds an illegal ad tech monopoly, where a judge is shortly going to deliver her ruling. He was also quoted in court papers, which I read over the weekend for an upcoming case, and testified that, quotes, "My feeling then and my feeling now is that they, social media, don't meaningfully care about user safety. It's not something that they spend a lot of time on. It's not something they think about. And I don't really think they care." So, hi, thank you both for coming on. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Amazing. So, here's where we are. We're 5 days into this landmark court case. The government's stated goal was to protect children by delaying their access to social media, content, and the engagement tools. I think we should think about that too, until they're 16 and more able to cope. Now, for most of you that are dropping in today, yesterday or last night, Australia fell victim to a terrible terror attack. Videos and very violent footage has flooded the very social media that's impacted by this action. There's been lots of differing opinions on this ban, and we're going to cover some of those today. But the main topic, and the one that divides most, is should we regulate the tech companies with laws to make them behave better? Should they police social content? Does that solve the problem? Or are we past that? And do we need laws to force the change? So Kelly, I wanted to come to you first on that one. What do you think? Can we ask them to be better, or do we have to tell them? Oh, Kelly, we've lost your audio.
You have me now?
There.
Awesome.
Yes, please.
Well, thanks, Ricky. I first just want to say how sorry I was to hear the news of what happened at Bondi Beach yesterday, our time, and it is so tragic. And one of the first thoughts I had was, there are far fewer children seeing graphic content because of these bold moves that Australia's leadership has taken, and I think that that's while not a proof point any of us would ever wish for, definitely part of the reality of this tragedy. I have been following this regulation very closely. I'm working here in the United States on legislation both at the federal level and at the state level around child safety, and a consistent concern where folks are kind of trying to pull apart and weaken the case for government intervention comes down to content. And one thing I really like about the social media delay in Australia is how content agnostic it is and how inclusive it is of other forms of social media harms. I have become close with families whose children or lost due to a variety of harms and threats from social media, um, based on predatory product design, right? Anywhere from predators and drug dealers being connected directly to kids, and the product incentivizing kids to participate in that interaction, to sextortion, to bullying, to pro suicide content. And the research has been unequivocal about how young people in particular are vulnerable to catastrophic result of these influences. And so I think that more and more the research and expertise and data has made a strong case for delay, and that's something that Australia and your leadership has taken into their own hands to help facilitate and really be an ally to parents and provide support and tools to enable that.
There are so many angles in this, Brian. Can I get your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I was talking with somebody recently. You always get that question as a parent. I'm a parent. My kids are older now. Of when should my kid be on social media? And I used to try to hem and haw this answer and be like, well, maybe this age, maybe that development. And it was really hard to get to a really good answer. And ran into this person recently who said that they now have an answer that they feel confident in, which is, your child can be ready for social media when they're ready to have ongoing deep conversations with complete strangers who have no connection to them, when they're ready to see all sorts of unimaginable types of porn in their accounts, and when they're ready to see a suicide of a human being or violent action and violent death, which my heart's broken because tragically we saw that where you are overnight, and that came just hours after we had a traumatic shooting at a university in the United States. And so all these things are happening in ways that our kids are being exposed to them without being ready for them, without knowing that they can meet a stranger who will then get them connected to a drug that is laced with fentanyl and puts them in a hospital, or worse, kills them. And what I'm excited about with this uproar that seems to be happening around your policy is that it's forcing the conversation, and it's really starting an important conversation. Because the thing that we've seen that is impossible to disprove is that the companies don't take enough steps themselves to provide the safety for teens and for youth that we need them to take. If they were taking the world's greatest precautions and really making sure our kids were safe, this wouldn't be a conversation. We wouldn't be wondering whether delay was the right approach or not. In absence of their action, this is a great step and an important action.
You've both worked in the inner sanctum of Meta. So you know this company, you know its culture, you know its motivations, yeah, its triggers. Why is that the case? Why is it the case that we are even having this conversation? Brian, perhaps I'll come to you first.
Yeah, it's all about ideology and goals. So if you believe that no matter what, your product will be slightly better for the world with it than without it, even if it was like 51-49, even if there was like massive death and harm, but it was slightly better for the progress of humanity, you'd probably keep pushing on that product if you are Mark Zuckerberg or one of those leaders. And that's how they think, is that they really truly believe this near religious belief that this product and this set of things and these goals are good for mankind incrementally, and that justifies an unimaginable amount of harms. And you can actually go all the way back and look at this essay by the now CTO of the company about the harms of the platform, the things you have to accept if you believe that connecting people is de facto good. And so there's this just
Brian,
religious belief. Go ahead.
Perhaps share that with us, and I'll share it with the audience. Kelly, can I ask you? You worked inside the metaverse. You saw some harms. You spoke up. Cost you your job. What's your view on the internal culture around those things that Brian was just talking about?
Well, when I hear arguments around needing to be pro-innovation, needing to hand it to tech to do the right thing. I mean, 10 years ago, I was nodding my head along with those arguments because I believed inherently that the company I worked for, that Brian and I spent a combined 26 years working at, would do the right thing ultimately. And as you mentioned, my last role at the company was working on Horizon Worlds, which is a virtual reality, well, now we're on mobile, they're on mobile too, but the kind of social layer of the Oculus headset. And everything turned upside down at that point because it was the first time I'd worked on a consumer product at the company. And the rest of the leaders on the product, as well as the folks we rolled directly into, including the chief technology officer, were aware that we had uh, m- the majority of the folks using the product were children who sounded and behaved like children under the age of 13. And at the time, Horizon wasn't technically available to children, to even teenagers. Those releases rolled out later. It was part of what they had asked me to do. And so it meant that these kids were all using adult accounts to access the product. And we were building the product in the likeness of Roblox, which had already been well established as a proven breeding ground for predators. And so the fact that it wasn't proactively a chief concern to figure out, well, how are we going to build a product that solves for some of the really critical problems that we're seeing in Roblox. But that wasn't a conversation at all that I heard. The conversation I heard was, how do we protect the company? How do we minimize liability? How do we, direct folks to not take notes on anything related to kids? On how to be very careful about how we position X, Y, and Z. What are the ways we can make parents feel safer, even though the product's not actually safe? And so that was a huge turning point for me, which was the beginning of what has become a kind of a gradual, undoing of the indoctrination that I experienced and I believe, to the point where, now I have gotten into so much of the evidence, so much of the research, so many people's stories, that I feel ashamed that I didn't uh, wake up to this earlier. And it's still in the scheme and the grand timeline of things early. And we have an opportunity still to intervene and to make a difference. On the question around kind of self-regulation, there have been, it's been 2 years since the U.S. Surgeon General released a warning on social media for teens. It's been, 3 or 4 years since the, whistleblower Arturo Bejar's email to Mark Zuckerberg saying, look at the harms that our kids are exposed to on Instagram. And if these companies wanted to, they would, but they aren't. And all of it comes down to profitability. All of it comes down to, how do we keep people engaged for the longest period of time so that we can make the most money? How do we extract the data that allows our advertising product to be more valuable to advertisers? And one thing I love about what Australia has done is there is a financial penalty tied to non-compliance here. And I predict we are going to see a sea change in how tech companies and social media companies are going to be suddenly innovating in child safety. We see that with Roblox. It's been 20 years since kids have been harmed in that product, and all of a sudden they're taking it seriously because incentives are aligned to do so.
Well, I hope that's true. And I know that I had the safety commissioner on this podcast last week, talking about some of these issues. And I think that very early on in the conversation, she said, we're trying to cause a big change here, and we're not going to get there overnight. This is going to be a step-by-step case. And I remember hearing in the back of my mind, I heard, in tech, we move fast and we break things. This sounded like, we've got something that's broken, so we're going to move fast to fix it. right? And I thought that was interesting. Let's change as we go. But what's interesting to me, and you guys have both written about this, the playbook, the response, how the markets and the social companies and the tech companies respond to these kinds of challenges, because there is huge amounts of money at stake. The precedent that this sets, it might just be Australia far away, but governments all over the world are already on the record saying they intend to follow suit once they start to learn what the fallout from this has been. So the playbook, the big tech playbook, has begun. I've started to see all across LinkedIn and in my newsletter and in other places the same talking points popping up. So I wanted to go through some of them quickly and get your thoughts. So one of the ones that comes up first is, it's government overreach. It's a parent's job to protect their children, and politicians can't be trusted. Okay, this is silencing free speech. Brian, thoughts?
It's kind of like if you were going to build a playground and you were going to put a giant pit in the playground with spikes in it, and then have the kind of bars that you do the handbars over the pit of spikes. And instead of saying, look, we'd like to have some regulations locally that say, look, no spikes below the handbars in the playground, you say, you know what? Put the spikes there. Like, I don't care. Let the parents deal with it. It's the parents' job to keep their kids safe on this inherently unsafe product that we've built. And that's the narrative that we're told, is that it's the parents' job, but it's a partnership. We don't think parents should be completely uninvolved in their children's education and rearing them, but we think that we should have products that are designed safely and that aren't harmful for them. So it really is that idea that, yes, parents should keep their kids safe, but there's so much that companies can do with partnership from government and regulations, like we have safety regulations around playgrounds and buildings, and the very things like seat belts that are not government overreach. They're just common sense things to keep us safe, and then to give parents the tools to keep their kids safe. The thing that kills me every time I hear the safe argument is recently I've been exposed to parents who are survivors of their children who've lost their lives. And they are working parents struggling to just juggle the everydays of life. And they are doing a good job, the best they can, to keep their kids safe. But with all these different social media platforms, there's too much to keep track of. And it's so hard to know all the things that you need to be the latest on top of to keep your kids safe if the platforms aren't doing it in a way that helps you. And so hearing these exhausted parents who've lost someone who really loved their kids and were caring for them, just is another point to me that the platforms and products should do more. And it's government's responsibility to kind of create those regulations and guideposts for them.
So
Completely. Can I add to that, Ricky? Yeah, I mean, I saw Amy Neville's name pop up on this live stream, and she's one of the parents that, like Brian's talking about, who lost a child due to social media harms. And, she spent 39 weeks, I think, on the road last year, meeting with kids, going to schools, educating folks. And it boils my blood that tech companies have this narrative that this should be this is a parenting issue, that when kids are harmed to social media, it's because they have parents who are disengaged, who don't care. Like, can you imagine loving your child so much that even after experiencing such a tragedy, you care that much and put so much effort and energy into protecting other kids. And if you compare that to what tech companies are doing to empower parents, I mean, at Horizon, it was, let's imply we have parental controls where we don't. Instagram teen accounts, Fair Play and Parents SOS released a research paper kind of in partnership with Arturo Bejar last month or the month before, that found that 47 of the safety tools bundled into Instagram the Instagram teen accounts, which is supposed to be protective, didn't actually work as they were described to. And so it's effectively these sugar pills where tech companies will both say parents are responsible, and then they create products that increase their comfort, but don't actually protect their kids. And so one thing that I really, really appreciate about what's happening in Australia is the way that, as Brian said, this is a partnership. Like, this regulation has been accompanied with a huge amount of parent education, webinars, FAQs, how to talk to your kids. Because yeah, like it's still there is a huge role for parents here, but in Brian's metaphor of the playground with the spikes in the sandbox, it's like, and a billionaire put those spikes there. And a billionaire, trillion-dollar companies profit from those spikes existing while they say parents need to do a better job watching their kids on those monkey bars.
Agreed. So there's so much to talk about here, and we could go into depth on any one of these talking points, but we have a limited amount of time. So I think it's really helpful for you to help educate the people that will listen that are perhaps being exposed to this playbook for the first time. So I'm going to go through a couple of these and perhaps get your thoughts. So after the it's for the parents to fix this, number one. The second one that's most common, I've been counting them. Kids will just switch to other apps, and that raises the risk of them finding the dark web or even worse content, right? You're forcing the children to be more at risk, not less. Kelly, your thoughts?
One thing that I really appreciate, I watched your interview with your e-safety commissioner, Julian Mingrant, and there is an expectation that social media companies are both going to audit, report on, and improve the technology if and when kids get around it. And I've watched a lot of the local reporting in Australia, interviews with kids talking about how they're getting around this. But at the end of the day, like, these aren't reasons to side with trillion dollar companies over kids and families. This regulation is still going to be a significant step in harm reduction, because one of the reasons why social media is so insidious and influential is due to the network effect of everyone being on it. And kids aren't seeking out, generally speaking, kids aren't seeking out dark web material. If they were, they would be going to the dark web in the first place. They're searching for inspirational breakup quotes and getting pro-suicide content, like a child named Mason Edens who died by suicide after TikTok fed him pro-suicide content in the wake of a breakup. And so, the other thing I was thinking when I was watching these interviews is it gives kids an out. Even the kids that didn't get the notification yet, we see, and you've reported on the amount of anxiety that many young people experience about social media, about the pressures to show up. And so I could imagine that whether it's I've been kicked off or saying I've been kicked off, they have an out now. But if you distribute kids across multiple secondary platforms, your e-safety commissioner has said that that's why it's modifiable, that list. But B, the power of the network effect is going to be much, much low. And the barrier to entry has gone up significantly.
That's a win. Brian, your thoughts?
No, I want to be conscious of time. I would echo what Kelly had said.
Very good. All right. So let's talk about the next one that's popped up. You're silencing children. They have freedom of speech also. I saw a really interesting version of that for the first time, which was these kids, when they turn 16, are 2 years from voting. Good luck, politicians. Yeah. You can kind of see what the not very subtle narrative is of that. So kids deserve freedom of speech too. You're silencing them. Many of these people need these social networks to maintain their social networks. They are isolated through personal reasons or geography. You are making them far worse off as a result of this.
I don't know if these folks have heard of texting or messaging, but these are very effective ways for people to communicate and share information and have groups. And that is what happens. And we see that kids spend a ton of time there as well. Here's the thing. This speech narrative is designed to really, I think it started out as an American narrative because in America with our, free speech core value, it kind of undercuts so many arguments here, but it's really a false argument. If you think about what happens on these platforms, imagine you are in a public square, and they like to talk about these platforms as being the town square where everyone's sharing ideas and counter ideas and counter speech, and it's this just like vibrant forum for speech. But then imagine that somebody comes into this town square. It's really crowded with people. You can't make out all the conversations. There's a lot of noise. Someone comes in and they drive in a truck. And in one end, they set up these giant speakers, massive, massive speakers. And in the middle of a stage, they put a microphone. And then they start going through the crowd and they're kind of handpicking people here or there. And they're actually putting them on the stage with these giant speakers. And that volume is louder than the crowd and it is like drowning out what's happening in the crowd. And they say something that everyone hates or someone hates. And the person wants to argue with them. And so they're there like arguing in the midst of all the people, trying to get their voice heard, but the speakers and the stage are just drowning them out. And there's no real speech. There's no real discussion. There's no real debate. So what these platforms are is they are a very selective magnifier of very selective speech. They don't really tell you what's actually going on. They don't really let you hear the breadth of opinion. They don't really work to inform you. They work to get you to click. They work to get you to stay on. They work to get you to share. They work to get you to post. And they know, not intentionally, but because what they reward their teams on is more engagement, that whatever content gets people to engage, we're showing more and more and more and more of that. So that becomes the way you decide who gets next on the stage with the microphone to speak. So these platforms are not really a free speech platform. They are a very limited amplification platform, and they don't really care about free speech. They care about your time being spent on the platform. They care about your clicks. So whenever you hear them say, we care about your speech, just say, we care about your minutes because you need more of them. We care about your clicks because we want them, because all of that turns into money and that money turns into power. And it's just that simple. And so that's why this free speech argument, particularly in this context, is not really about protecting people's speech.
Brian, if I could ask a supplementary question on that. I was asked last week by a publisher here in Australia that focuses on the media, advertising and marketing markets to write about what this social media ban means for marketers. Is this the moment for a marketer to say, I don't think I should put my brand's money here if the government is saying this is directly harmful? Now, the interesting thing is, and Kelly knows this, when I've been writing about the Meta antitrust trial and when I've been writing about the commercials, 97.2% of Meta's revenue comes from advertising. And so it's an advertising monopoly. Okay. It is a social media product, but it's actually an advertising business. Okay. And when you're talking about engagement directly links to advertising, and you ran advertising at Meta. Is that a fair indictment? And there's a secondary part to this, which is that the ACCC, which is Australia's competition and consumer regulator, okay, is also running a separate piece of work at the moment to pass a different law that puts restrictions on advertising to social media and banning all advertising on social media for under 16s. So we've seen one side of the coin, if you like, and we're about to see the other. So, Brian, is this an advertising driven problem? Is this a commercial incentives problem at its core?
Yeah, you're speaking to somebody who has a lot of criticisms about the global economy and how we've wired it for shareholder value above all other things. And this is a symptom of that. If you look at a really interesting period of time when the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, came out, she brought a bunch of horrific revelations about the company around human trafficking in the Middle East, cartel recruitment in the global South, on and on and on and on, youth harms in the US. And the stock took a $3 billion hit for about a week or two and then kind of recovered when the market was like, oh, we're going to weather this storm. And even though there was evidence and concern and smoke about these harms, the market kind of like took it as a blip. A couple months later, there was a report, a filing from the company on their profitability, and the market was like, you're spending too much money and you're not making the profits we want, and they crushed the stock. Absolute nosedive. And the company responded and took drastic move fast and break things actions by cutting costs and firing a ton of people. And the market cheered balloons and celebrations and confetti and brought the stock right roaring back up to the heights of the greatest heights that it is today. So the market penalizes you for not making more money, and it doesn't reward you for keeping people safe. And so the companies just follow that market logic. And so as advertisers pump more dollars into these platforms, as it's funded by engagement and time spent and more people and distribution, that is the fuel to the fire that goes into these systems.
Thank you. Kelly, I want to come to you with a question. I've read a lot of your work on your Substack, Overturned, and um, I can tell you care very passionately from a personal perspective, a humanity perspective to solving this problem. And there are so many people in this conversation that want to do real good, okay, but offering opinions without maybe sitting down and thinking about how they play to large numbers of marketers and lawyers who are exactly trying to trigger certain misinformation and disinformation. I can see you both nodding. It's kind of like these dark alleys. We'll send them down here because we know how to deal with that. And we'll send them down here because we know we have a policy for dealing with that. So this week I saw a post by the Australia's Human Rights Commissioner. And she warned in her post that the social media ban would lead to increased surveillance and data collection. And I'm going to give you a quote, Kelly, that she said, and I'm interested in your thoughts on it. She said, under this ban, large numbers of Australians will be asked to upload ID or biometric data, creating high-value troves of personal information. That's the real shift that is happening here. We're moving to a world where the law requires you to be profiled in order to participate.
Hmm.
Okay.
Well, listen, I understand people's concern about uploading ID in order to, as a pay to play for internet experiences. When my son was trying to download an Xbox game a few months ago and I needed to prove that I was his parent and upload ID. And there's a little discomfort there. And I have to ask myself, do I trust Microsoft with this data? And was able to land on yes. And if I think that there's far less comfort with the idea of Facebook, Snapchat, TikTok having my government ID. And if that's a problem, it's a problem for these tech companies to bear and solve, and not a problem for kids to bear by enduring additional harms. That said, again, I'm a huge fan of the kind of technical approach to this regulation, the waterfall approach, as Julian Grant mentioned, because at the first level, it doesn't, no one's being asked to upload government ID initially, right? It's based on age estimation. The next step is, uploading a selfie for, oftentimes with third parties in a privacy first way, not storing that data to estimate age. And even that first step, like these companies, Brian and I both worked at Facebook when 10 years ago, Facebook had a very, very good idea of how old everyone was, based on, are they out of school from 8 to 4 p.m. What are their, movement patterns? What do they buy? What type of content do they engage with? And it's just really interesting to me that we are willing to, be the product of an advertising system that is collecting all of this data anyway. But then when the conversation moves to the same technology, keeping kids safe from proven harms, that's where the line gets drawn.
Brian, I responded to the Human Rights Commissioner's comment by saying, I think we can safely assume that Meta knows a fair amount about the people on its platform, and it will have a fairly good idea of how many people are under the age of 16. Because we tested this last Friday. We on the day that the ban came into being, we tried to buy advertising on Australian children on some of these social platforms, and we were still able to buy 13-year-old children's ads. Okay, so the argument that this is going to force people to hand over more information. Actually, no, forget me saying it. Let me ask you. You worked inside the middle of this. I'd imagine you had a fair idea how many young users you had.
Yeah, you were kind of doing a great idea, a great answer there that was pretty much what I'd be saying, right? Which is, I think it's the right intent to say we really need to wrestle with what information we want these companies having, but this is the wrong place to place that question. We should be having it at the broadest sense of the question. as Kelly alluded to, the amounts of data that any tech company, any of the large tech companies, and even the small companies you've never heard of collect around individuals and can string together profiles that are way more robust and more accurate than any identification that you carry. The government ID is almost inconsequential in that regard, as to developing an understanding of who people are and profiles around them. So the conversation should be a bigger one around data and data privacy, and what do we expect as a society and as a community around our rights on our data, and what we want as far as rights to be forgiven and forgotten and whatever else. So I understand the concern, which is this kind of nebulous, what if we give them more data? That's not the issue. Let's talk about the big issue around the data that's there. And then to Kelly's point, that's one of the that's not the primary way that we can do this. We can have companies just do it with the data that they already know and the estimates they already make to keep people safe.
I was on a podcast on Friday and somebody said to me, Ricky, how would you measure the success of this? What do you think? How do we know if we're winning? All right. This was my response, but I'd love you to fill in the gaps where I'm wrong. My first one was Julian Grant, the e-safety commissioner, said that in 10 days' time, she's going to require the platforms to tell her how many accounts have been suspended. Okay. Now, I really like that question because that sounds like the really kind of sophisticated way the Department of Justice would have handled it. It's basically, you've only managed to disable 20,000 accounts. We've got lots and lots of teeth over here, which means a big fine's coming your way. So if it's only 20,000, that's bad. If it's 200,000, then it proves they were always able to say who the kids were. So there's a no-win scenario for you if you're the tech company in the middle of that mix. And so for me, that was the first test of success. Now, Brian, I'm going to come to you quickly, and I'll come straight to you, Kelly. On that one, you've been before the Senate. You've answered a lot of these very tricky questions. Is that a measure of success? Is that the start? Is that the first Band-Aid off accountability for us to see what actually happens?
I would actually turn this question to the experts and people who are experts on youth health and youth safety to say what's going to make them feel comfortable. It would be really interesting to me is, do we have a group of teens and a group of youth that we've brought together to say, like, what would it look like for this to be better for you? In fact, what if we did like an assembly of youth to say, because you talk to youth and they're like, I need it because I'm out of touch if I'm not on it, but I hate it. Like, they don't have this like deep love relationship with it. And what would it look like to make it amazing for them? I think they know. And so I think a lot of this comes from the community. A lot of this comes from the experts. And I think the more we try to look at metrics that we've seen in the past, like number of accounts active or deactive or whatnot, we'll probably miss the forest for the trees on it.
Very good. Kelly?
Yeah, I agree with what both of you said. I think that the specific metrics, based on my understanding of the child safety research, is that we'll be looking to Australia over the next, it'll be 6 months, a year, 2 years before there's kind of probably a meaningful shift in data. But I expect we'll see significant differences in rates of depression and anxiety among young people in Australia. Differences in rates of suicide, differences in outcomes at school, participation in offline activities, differences in, I would be measuring how many hours of sleep are kids getting? How is that changing? I would be measuring instances of cyberbullying. I mean, I think it was like 50% of kids online have experienced cyberbullying. How does that change? I mean, there's still access to messaging apps. There's still texting. Cyberbullying won't go away, but I bet that we will see a significant decrease, and that will have a ripple effect in so many other areas that are causing harm to kids.
Amazing. So, do you think we're 5 past midnight on the first day of fixing this, or is it 5 to midnight on ending something that's been really bad? I mean, where are we on the kind of time continuum of this? Because I think we all know there has to be a better version, right? I think everybody, I assume that everybody accepts that that's the case. Perhaps from what you said earlier, Brian, perhaps I'm misguided there, but is this a moment for hope for parents, do you think? Or are we just into another round of backbiting and fighting?
I mean, when evidence shows a product potentially harms kids, society has a duty to act. And in many cases, society, uh, governments have failed to take right-sized action against the evidence. That's not true across every single you know jurisdiction. But I think that this is, to answer your initial question, the beginning of, Julian Ming Grant said it's Australia's seatbelt moment. Like, we don't allow a 14-year-old to drive a car down the road, not because cars are all bad. That's not the argument made, but because they're not ready for it. We don't allow children to access casinos or buy alcohol or buy cigarettes because these are products that have been proven to be addictive and harmful to many. And it's kind of basic common sense that those laws exist at this point. And 10 years from now, I think that we will see what has started this week in Australia. Everywhere. And I think that it will be, we won't be talking about many of the issues that we're talking about now. We'll be talking about how to ensure that we're comprehensively protecting young people from these proven harms.
It's amazing.
Look, I think you guys acted. Like, we shouldn't miss the point that Australia took a big step.
Mm-hmm.
And took a risky step in saying, we're going to take a stance and we're going to do something that we believe, with the best of our knowledge and abilities, is the right step for now and for us. And I think that is a brave, heroic, and important step to actually take action and do something. So, like, that is incredibly hopeful. Let's also think about just where these devices go. Maybe your phone at some point in the future goes away, but where does it go? Probably goes in your glasses, I guess, or into your contacts. So, like, this idea of information being ever present, it's not going to go away. It's just going to change the form. Do we think that feeds and this kind of information exposure is just a passing blip? Probably not, right? It probably gets even more ubiquitous in your glasses and in wherever devices that you have. And we think about the content that you're seeing. Well, Mark Zuckerberg a few months ago talked about the loneliness epidemic. And that the good news is that, people have space for a lot more friends. They have time in their lives where they could have more friends in their lives. So what should we do? We should create some AI friends for them so that we can fill their feed and fill their life with AI friends. Now, do you trust Mark to create AI friends for your kid? I mean, sit with that for a minute, right? And picture the direction that these platforms have gone without any guidance, without any safety, without any kind of societal touch point to say, do we want that? Do we not want that? It's going to happen. And so I think these technologies are going to continue to march. They're going to continue to evolve. They're going to continue to be present. And they're going to increasingly try to find their way into more of our lives and minds and time, back to our earlier conversation, because of the profit motivation there. If they control more and more of our lives, that is the thing that motivates them and will keep them on this press, so that we are early in this fight. I think that regulation now is so important. As the CEO of Netflix said a few years ago, their competitor, when they were looking at who competed with Netflix, was sleep.
Hmm.
And so with all these devices, we're going to be competing with sleep, with health, with rest, in an environment where at least Australia has taken a step early on in this game. So I tend to think it's pretty early. I tend to think it's really important to take bold, brave action. And then I think it's important to listen and see what sort of move fast and fix things and tweak the regulations that we need to be doing.
Amazing. So, Brian, I just want to stick with you on this because I've seen you speak on this before. To make the changes that we want to happen, you either bring in laws or you manage to persuade or you make the threat scary enough that the leadership of these companies decide to change direction. All right. And so I also ought to say that this isn't just about Meta. Okay. This is also involving multiple other platforms. 47% of Snap's earnings last year came from under 18s. So I think it's important to also recognize this is wide and broad. But you've made it pretty clear that you don't necessarily think that Mark Zuckerberg is likely to change direction for as long as he's in charge of Meta. And to change Meta needs a change of leadership. Can you explain why?
I think I've seen no evidence that he would take it a different direction. I think I've seen every evidence to the contrary, that presented with information and data that could make the product healthier and safer, he chooses not to. Now, even with that change of leadership, there's a cost of doing business for these companies where the fines and these fees that they could pay would be a calculation. 1.2 billion or 3 billion or whatever sounds scary and big might hit the accounting kind of question of, I don't know, we're going to pay 1.2 billion, but we're going to make 1.5. So that's plus 300 million. It's kind of worth it. Let's do it. And then we'll see when we get caught again. And just as long as we stay ahead of the fines, it's a great business decision. And so unless the teeth are, great white sized teeth that are real kind of ending consequences, or better yet, some of the people have talked about personal criminal liability, because that would change the temperature pretty quick. If it was a question of personal criminal liability for folks running some of these companies, I think you'd see a very different approach and different tenor to the way some of these conversations go. So with that, I don't think that on their own the leadership will change. I think the size of the fines would have to be crippling to the company in such a way that it would make them act fundamentally differently and not just a cost of doing business calculation.
Well, two things on that, Brian. First thing is that Australia is pretty good at great whites. That I think that's fairly well known in the world. And the other thing is that about 18 months ago, and Kelly, I think you know this, I was invited to address the UN, and they asked me, what would you do? And I said, you should prosecute under your existing laws. You don't need more laws. You have laws. You can use those laws. You can bring criminal liability if you decide to prosecute under the laws you have. And there's kind of silence in the room when you have that conversation. I think people start to get a bit nervous when it becomes to personal liability. But I do think that you're right. Kelly, you've also looked at other countries and the behavior in other countries. There's a lot of talk here that this is an assumption that this is an American imposed thing that the rest of the world has to accept. But the interesting thing is that, in a phone call, I had phone calls with Denmark, South Africa, just in the last 5 or 6 days, asking me specifically about this law and, wanting to follow it up. The UK asking the same questions. If we see a situation where we have different laws in different countries and that spreads out very quickly and people follow this, do you think, A, there's any prospect that America will? And secondly, and this is probably a question for both of you, and do you think it's possible to rein them in if it's all outside America?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, yes, I mean, I am very hopeful that the U.S. will enact a duty of care legislation in some capacity, will repeal Section 230, which many of these companies currently stand behind. It's just a matter of when. Right now, one of the strategies that tech companies use is money to drive influence with politicians in the form of putting data centers in their home state. That prompted Mike Johnson, who was expected to bring COSA to the floor last year, to completely turn his back to the parents that he had asked to stand behind him as show ponies. It seems for a superficial, I think, interest. You also have, Sarah Wynne Williams writes in her memoir, Careless People, about the kind of explicit strategy of Facebook's leadership to get politicians and world leaders so dependent on the product itself to get elected that they would be reticent to regulate it. And I think that these kind of forces were built brick by brick, and we're going to have to pull them apart brick by brick. And I think that this step in Australia is a critically important one to get this conversation going. Like, these harms are real. These harms are real enough that an entire continent has made these products unavailable to those who are under 16. And I expect to see other jurisdictions follow quickly. Will the U.S. be in the kind of front of that pack? I sure hope so, but I don't expect that.
Brian, is there any prospect the US will join?
The US is a funny place and we've got our issues right now, but we love our kids. And so I think that there will be a continued push inside the United States to figure out ways to protect our kids in these platforms. But at the same time, the vast majority of Facebook's users are not in the United States. And while the revenue is concentrated in the United States, the global economy is on the verge of some pretty massive shifts over the next 10 to 20 years. So you could see a very, very different financial set of incentives for the company if the other countries around the world, the ones that are going to most benefit, I think, from the current economic shifts, start to take this stuff quite seriously.
That's amazing. I'm about 3/4 of the way through an investigation at the moment with UNICEF to look at where the majority of the people are, where the majority of Meta's earnings are, where their markets are now saturated, and where their growth is going to come from. And you find some really interesting data. You're both nodding. I'd imagine you've
Yeah,
had a look at the same data points and you say, well, we're not going to get a ton of growth out of America anymore. But hey, look at the size of the Indian subcontinent.
for
Let's
sure.
have a look at Africa. Okay. And so there are geopolitical issues here as well. Perhaps if we can get the laws in those places and they're talking about it, we may be able to put up a barrier of protection for kids before the marketing and the media and the money incentives land. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yes.
I like that picture. That's a good picture.
I want to say thank you to both of you. First of all, for your work. There's lots of jeopardy for everybody that wants to take on these big tech companies, even more so if you've been executives within them. I can imagine that that's been quite draining emotionally and professionally upon both of you. And bravo to you for having the courage to do that. I think everybody would say, everybody on our side of this argument would say thank you to you for that. I did want to give you both, though, the opportunity to say anything that you wanted to say before we jump off, because, I can have a million views, but I haven't lived in the epicenter of it like you have. So, Brian, any final comments?
Yeah, I think the final thought for me is that this is our choice as citizens of the globe and citizens of our nations and citizens of our states and localities. We're told that we're powerless in this, but we're not. We need to kind of recapture what it means to be a citizen and have voice about the outcomes that we want in our lives and our society. And it's up to us collectively to start to dictate the terms and not say that there's some genius visionary boy wonder in Silicon Valley who's creating some product that's going to have a vision that saves the world, because it's not. It's going to be us. And so I'm hopeful at this point in time that we're taking some really good, bold steps, that we're going to start to see some success in these areas, learn from them, and do it more. But that's the takeaway for me: is it is up to us, and it's something that we can do. And it's something that citizens can band together to dictate the digital future that we want, and not take it out of Silicon Valley.
We're all parents. Kelly, final word to you.
To that point, I was thinking about an earlier point you made, Ricky, about if we have kind of disparate legislation in different places, and I've heard the argument many times that that would create kind of an undue business pressure on companies like Meta to comply with, and I I really want to paint the picture that we're talking about the difference between a billionaire-owned trillion-dollar company with enough resources to, as you mentioned, fly drones over Africa when they wanted to capture that user base, up against a child who's alone in their bedroom with the device glowing in their face. And we're asking that child and their parents to absorb the cost of the inaction of the billionaire. and the trillion-dollar company. And we need to kind of keep that image in our mind, keep the image of the monkey bars and the sandbox with spikes in our minds, because there's a lot of money and a lot of really smart people that want us thinking about this in all of these theoretical ways. But this isn't a matter of theory. This is a matter of real kids dying and experiencing kind of irreversible harms to their lives because of what's in the best interest of a billionaire.
Well, I'm sure we could talk about this for weeks, and maybe we'll come back to it another time. But I want to say thank you to both of you for investing your time to explain this to people. I can't imagine there's a topic that is closer to parents' minds as we pass through this. So thank you so, so much, both of you, for coming on. And let's keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.